What if I told you that the 1.5 million refugees who arrived in Germany back in 2015 didn't actually shrink the national wealth,
Right.
but they actually mathematically guaranteed that the native population would get richer?
It's a wild thought.
Yeah, and not just, some abstract increase in the country's gross domestic product. I mean, an actual measurable bump in the per capita income of the people who are already living there.
Exactly.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are partnering with Empower Migra, which is a dedicated focus aiming to unpack the rigorous scientific studies surrounding migration, integration, and basically the socioeconomic realities of discrimination.
Yeah, we're really cutting through the noise today to bring the raw data directly to you.
Right, because that statistic, the one about the native population getting richer, it catches people off guard.
Oh, completely. It completely short-circuits how we are conditioned to view crises. I mean, when we see massive logistical mobilization,
Like
right?
emergency housing and stuff.
Exactly. Emergency housing, language programs, massive administrative overhauls. Our brains immediately just tally up the expenditure. We see money leaving the state's coffers, and we instinctively assume a corresponding drop in our own societal wealth.
We categorize human beings arriving at a border strictly as, like, a physical liability.
We do. We absolutely do.
Which brings us to the central provocation of today's deep dive. I want you to ask yourself, are refugees truly an economic burden on a host nation? Or do we fundamentally misunderstand the mechanics of how a national economy actually operates?
That is the big question.
It is. And to answer that, we are tearing into a landmark 2015 macroeconomic study titled Integrating Refugees, a Long-Term Worthwhile Investment. It was authored by Marcel Fratzscher and Simon Junker from the DIW Berlin, which is the German Institute for Economic Research.
A very highly respected institution, by the way.
Right. And our mission here is to just strip away the evening news soundbites and look exclusively at the empirical, long-term economic forecasting.
The Fratzscher and Junker paper is, well, what's fascinating here is that it forces us to confront the gap between our street-level intuition and macroeconomic reality.
A narrative on the street.
Exactly. Street-level intuition tells you that, if the state spends 10 billion euros on refugee integration, the society is then 10 billion euros poorer.
Right, because it relies on the assumption that national spending works like a household budget.
Yes. The household checking account fallacy.
Right, like if I buy a tractor for a farm, my bank account drops today. Or if I spend my salary on a new roof, my bank account is depleted.
You see the money go out and it's just gone.
But I don't call the tractor a burden. I call it a capital investment. So are we making a category error with human capital? Because a national economy doesn't function like a closed-loop checking account.
It really doesn't.
It's more like, think of it like a massive power grid.
Okay, I like that.
Imagine a city expanding its grid to connect a huge new industrial park. Initially, that new sector draws a massive amount of current. The infrastructure costs are astronomical, and the lights in the older parts of the city might even, flicker under the strain.
Yeah, the initial shock to the system.
Right. And if you only look at that first year, it looks like a terrible drain on the system. But you aren't just plugging in consumers.
You are plugging in new generators.
Exactly. Once those factories are online, they produce their own energy, they stabilize the network, and eventually they feed more power back into the broader grid than they ever took out.
That is a much more accurate framework. The prevalent public narrative fails because it only measures the voltage drop in year one.
Yeah.
It treats human capital as a sunk cost rather than an infrastructure investment. And, a sunk cost is a finalized transaction. It's money spent that never generates future value.
But the DIW Berlin researchers didn't see it that way.
No, they set out to mathematically map that generator phase you mentioned. They modeled the specific chain reactions triggered by that initial, undeniably massive state expenditure over a 10 to 20-year horizon.
And to understand their model, we really have to look at the baseline reality they were dealing with in 2015.
The context is crucial here.
Because the scale was staggering. The
Yeah.
German federal government initially estimated around 800,000 asylum seekers would arrive that year.
Which is already a huge number.
Right, but Fratzscher and Junker looked at the reality on the ground and realized that number was already hopelessly obsolete.
Yeah, they had to adjust their model's baseline immediately. They bumped it to 1.5 million for 2015.
Wow.
And then another 1.5 million for 2016, tapering down to 750,000 in 2017, and then a steady 500,000 annually through 2020.
The sheer logistical shock of those revised numbers, I mean, it just cannot be overstated.
It was unprecedented. Between January and September of 2015 alone, over 163,000 individuals were processed through the EASY system in a single month.
In 1 month.
In 1 month. And for context, the EASY system, it's an acronym for Erstverteilung der Asylbegehrenden, is basically Germany's IT network for the initial distribution of asylum seekers.
Yeah.
It utilizes the Königsteiner Schlüssel, which is a quota system that calculates how many refugees each of the 16 German states must take based on their tax revenue and population size.
So it's essentially a load balancing mechanism.
Exactly.
It's designed to prevent any single municipality from experiencing a total systemic collapse. But even with the load distributed, the financial requirements were immediate.
Oh, absolutely. And the study is remarkably transparent about the upfront price tag. They aren't hiding it.
No, they lay it all out.
During the initial application stage, which, by the way, can take a year or more, the state incurs an annual cost of approximately $12,000 per refugee.
Wait, 12,000 euros a year per person? That is a massive baseline investment.
It is. But that 12,000 figure is crucial to unpack. It isn't just, pocket money handed to individuals.
Right, it's not cash in hand.
Not at all. It encompasses the entire administrative apparatus. It covers the construction and operation of initial reception centers.
The physical infrastructure.
Yep. Plus, the salaries of the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, the BAMF personnel who were working massive overtime to process claims, plus emergency health care and the foundational language and integration courses.
Wow, okay. So macroeconomically, that 12,000 laro equated to roughly 1/3 of the average per capita income in Germany at the time.
Yes, it is a huge capital injection per person.
And the spending doesn't just stop once an application is stamped.
No, it doesn't. If someone is recognized as a refugee but cannot immediately secure employment, they transition into the standard social safety net.
Which in 2015 meant the Hartz IV system.
Exactly.
And for those unfamiliar, Hartz IV, which is now known as Bürgergeld, is Germany's strict means-tested unemployment benefit system.
It's the baseline.
Right. It provides the absolute bare minimum for subsistence. We're talking rent for a very modest apartment, heating, and a tightly calculated monthly stipend for food and basic needs.
And the study models this ongoing cost at about 7,200 laro annually.
Which is roughly 20% of the average per capita income.
Right. And then we also have to account for the most politically contentious group.
The rejected applicants.
Yeah, those whose asylum applications are rejected but who cannot be deported immediately, usually due to missing documents or active dangers in their home country.
So they get what Germany calls a Duldung.
A tolerated status, yes. It is a legal purgatory. They are required to stay, but their access to the labor market is severely restricted or in some cases outright banned.
But the state still has to provide for them.
Under the Asylum Seekers Benefits Act, yes.
Okay.
Which the DIW calculates at roughly 5,400 per year.
Okay, so when you take those figures, the 12,000, the 7,200, the 5,400 outweigh, and you multiply them by millions of arrivals,
the numbers get very big, very fast.
You are looking at tens of billions of euros in new government spending. And the Fratzscher and Juncker model establishes these billions as the unvarnished baseline investment. They don't try to hide it at all.
They embrace it because the pivot is in how they interpret the destination of those funds. The public views this as money lost, but the economists view it as an aggressive, localized economic stimulus package.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. We're forgetting that these people have to eat, they have to buy clothes, and they have to rent apartments.
Exactly.
Where does that money go?
It comes down to the concept of economic velocity and the dual identity of the newly arrived. The public looks at an asylum seeker and sees a pure recipient of state funds.
A drain on the system.
But the economist sees a consumer whose marginal propensity to consume is exactly 100%.
Let's define that for a second, just to be clear. The marginal propensity to consume means that if you give a person an extra euro, how much of it will they spend versus how much they'll save?
Right.
Like if you give a billionaire a tax break, they probably invest it in offshore assets or stick it in a vault. It doesn't circulate in the local economy.
But if you give a refugee a Hartz V payment,
they spend every single cent immediately because they have to.
They absolutely have to. They are starting with zero physical assets. That 7,200 annual subsistence payment doesn't just evaporate into thin air. It flows instantly into the cash register of the local grocery store.
Yes. It pays the rent to a German landlord. It pays the municipal utility company for electricity and water.
So the state is essentially funneling capital through the refugee directly into the domestic private sector.
Precisely. By meeting the basic survival needs of the arrivals, the government inadvertently juices the aggregate demand of the entire country.
Wow. Okay, so the local baker sells more bread, so he has to order more flour, which means the regional mill has to hire another driver.
And this brings us to a really fascinating piece of the DIW's methodology, the multiplier effect.
Right, let's talk about the multiplier effect.
The multiplier is basically the mathematical heartbeat of this study. When the government spends €1 on a refugee housing complex, it pays the wages of local construction workers and social workers.
Who then take those salaries and spend them. Exactly, they spend them in the wider economy, buying cars, going to restaurants. The initial state euro does double or triple duty.
But Fratzscher and Juncker didn't want to be accused of painting a rosy picture here.
No, they didn't. They deliberately kneecapped their own model to ensure it could withstand scrutiny from skeptics.
Right. So what multiplier did they use?
They applied a highly conservative fiscal multiplier of 0.5 for the vast majority of these expenditures.
Okay, so in plain terms, they assumed that for every single euro the government spent on refugee integration, it only generated 50 cents of additional follow-on economic activity.
Which is very low. Most standard economic stimulus packages assume a multiplier greater than 1.0.
Like a euro spent generates a euro 20 or something.
Exactly. By choosing 0.5, the DIW Berlin researchers basically built a worst-case friction scenario into their demand-side projections.
And the data still showed massive economic stimulation.
It did. But that demand shock is just the first half of the equation. We are still just talking about the refugees as consumers.
Right. The real paradigm shift happens when we look at the supply side, when these individuals actually transition into the workforce.
And if you look at the demographic data of who is actually arriving in 2015, it reads like a targeted rescue package for the German pension system.
Okay, unpack that demographic data for us.
The demographic profile is the linchpin of the whole supply side argument. According to the data available, an overwhelming 72.7% of the asylum seekers arriving were of working age.
Which they define as between 15 and 74 years old, right?
Correct. And even more critically, well over half of those working-age individuals were under the age of 34.
Over half under 34, that is a demographic goldmine.
It really is, especially when you connect this to the bigger picture. You have to view that 72.7% statistic against the backdrop of Germany's looming domestic crisis.
Because Germany is staring down the barrel of a demographic shotgun.
Very much so. The baby boomer generation, the absolute bedrock of their post-war industrial miracle, is hitting retirement age.
The Renteneintrittwelle, right, the retirement wave.
Yes, and the ratio of active workers paying into the system versus elderly citizens drawing state pensions is collapsing. It's an inverted demographic pyramid.
So in a healthy economy, you might have, what, 3 or 4 workers supporting one retiree?
Exactly. But Germany is trending toward a ratio closer to 1.5 to 1.
Yikes.
Without a massive influx of young, working-age tax contributors, the state faces a brutal mathematical reality. They either drastically slash the pensions of the elderly, or they tax the remaining young native workforce into poverty to cover the deficit.
So suddenly 1 million young people show up, offering a direct demographic counterbalance.
It's exactly what the system needs.
But wait, this is where I have to play the skeptic on behalf of the listener. Because a Syrian engineer can't just walk into the Siemens headquarters in Munich and start working on a turbine.
No, they can't.
The friction of reality is immense. I mean, the German credentialing system is notoriously rigid. A degree from Damascus might not be legally recognized. And the language barrier is a massive hurdle.
Huge hurdles.
So how does the model account for the fact that these people can't just plug and play into a highly specialized Western industrial economy?
It's a great point, and the study handles this by building profound delays and inefficiencies into its labor market projections.
They didn't assume overnight success.
Not at all. The researchers assumed absolutely zero labor market participation from refugees in their first full year of arrival.
Zero.
Zero. And zero participation in the second year as well.
Wow. So they modeled 24 continuous months of pure financial drain with zero supply-side production.
Just to account for the bureaucratic friction of asylum processing, security checks, and basic language acquisition.
That is extremely conservative.
And the caution doesn't stop there. When they project out to year 3 and beyond, they don't assume a magical 100% employment rate either.
What do they assume?
In their baseline scenario, which is their most realistic middle ground estimate, They assume an initial unemployment rate of 60% for those actively seeking work.
So only 4 in 10 find jobs initially.
Yeah.
Okay, let's dive into the quality of those jobs. Because if someone with a master's degree in literature is forced to work in a warehouse because their German isn't at a C1 level yet, their economic output is severely suppressed.
Oh, absolutely. And to quantify that suppression, Fratzscher and Juncker utilized data from the SOEP.
The socioeconomic panel.
Yes, the socioeconomic panel is a longitudinal survey that has tracked the income, employment, and life trajectories of tens of thousands of German households since 1984.
So it's very robust data.
Very. It doesn't just ask if someone is employed, it measures hourly wages, skill levels, and overall productivity.
Right.
And based on SOEP data regarding past integration waves, the DIW assumed that initially newly recognized refugees would largely be pushed into low-skilled, marginal employment.
What Germany calls mini-jobs.
Exactly.
Now, mini-jobs are heavily regulated, low-wage positions. They're often capped at a few €100 a month, requiring minimal specialized skills. If the model assumes refugees are relegated to these roles, their tax footprint is practically zero. So how does that help the macroeconomic picture?
Well, initially it doesn't. It creates a massive initial drag. The SOEP data indicates that workers in these marginal roles operate at a productivity level roughly 30% below the national average.
Okay.
And the study bakes that 30% penalty right into the model. They assume the refugees are producing less value per hour, earning significantly less, and contributing fewer taxes than the average native citizen for several years.
Well, we also have to factor in the acceptance rate, right?
Yeah.
Which acts as the ultimate valve on human capital, because not everyone is allowed to stay and work.
Right.
The 2015 influx saw a rising acceptance rate, hitting around 39% to 45%, largely due to the high volume of people fleeing the active war zone in Syria,
And the baseline model anchors on a 45% acceptance rate,
leaving 55% facing rejection.
which is a huge portion. The model assumes a slow, grinding attrition for this group. It projects that half of the rejected individuals who are given that tolerated status will leave the country relatively soon.
But what about the other half?
It assumes that even after 5 years, a full 25% of all refugees without residence permits are still lingering in Germany, trapped in that legal purgatory, unable to work, and still costing the state $5,400 per year.
Let's just summarize the stress test this model is running. It assumes 2 entire years of zero economic output.
Yes.
It assumes a 60% initial unemployment rate.
Right.
It assumes those who do find work are 30% less productive than average. And it assumes a persistent multi-year financial burden from rejected individuals who are legally barred from contributing.
It is a model designed to simulate walking through economic quicksand.
Which is what makes their ultimate findings so unassailable. I mean, to map the horizon of this investment, they ran 3 distinct simulations. The baseline, an optimistic scenario, and a pessimistic scenario.
Let's break those down. In the baseline, we have the parameters we just discussed: 45% acceptance, 80% labor market participation for the working age cohort, and that initial 60% unemployment rate.
And the optimistic scenario.
It tweaks the dials slightly upward: a 50% acceptance rate, an 85% participation rate, and a lower initial unemployment rate of 50%.
Makes sense.
It also assumes the administrative costs in the first year drop to 33% of per capita income, reflecting increasing governmental efficiency as the bureaucracy adapts to the volume.
But the pessimistic scenario is the one that really demands our attention. This is the model built to validate the darkest fears of the public debate.
It is. In the pessimistic run, the acceptance rate drops to 40%. Labor market participation falls to 75%. Initial unemployment spikes to 65%.
Ouch.
And most devastatingly, they assume labor productivity is a full 50% below the national average instead of 30%.
And they double the initial costs. I remember reading that. They assume the state spends an astronomical 66% of the average per capita income on processing and housing during that first year.
Exactly. Everything that can go wrong does go wrong. The bureaucracy is inefficient, the integration is sluggish, and the labor market is hostile.
And
yet, even in this artificially constructed nightmare scenario, the macroeconomic net effect on the country's GDP ultimately turns positive.
that is just incredible. The power grid stabilizes and starts generating a surplus. How many years does it take in that worst-case scenario?
Under the most severe pessimistic constraints, the benefits dominate the costs after about 5 to 10 years.
So the initial net effect is definitively negative.
Yes, dragging down the GDP in 2015 and 2016. But by the early 2020s, the lines on the graph cross zero and begin an unbroken climb into positive territory.
And in the baseline and optimistic models, I imagine that break-even point arrives even faster.
Much faster, in just 4 or 5 years.
So the state recoups its massive initial outlay through expanded tax revenues and a broader GDP base. But this is the exact moment we have to address the paradox we opened with.
The native population wealth.
Yes, the study doesn't just predict a balanced federal budget. It predicts that the individual wealth of the native, non-refugee population increases.
This is the most counterintuitive mechanism in the entire study, and it requires a deep understanding of how wealth is distributed in an expanding economy.
Because, if you add 1.5 million new people to a country, common sense suggests you are dividing a fixed pool of resources among more individuals.
The pizza analogy.
Exactly. If you have a pizza with 8 slices and you invite 4 more people to the table, everyone gets a smaller slice.
But that zero-sum logic is it's the fundamental flaw in the public discourse. An economy is not a fixed pizza.
No, it's not.
It is a biological ecosystem that expands its boundaries based on the energy flowing through it. Let's trace how the wealth actually transfers to the native population. We discussed the demand effect earlier, right? The surge in local consumption funded by state benefits.
Right, the local grocer selling more food, the landlords renting more apartments, the construction firms securing massive government contracts to build housing.
Well, when that aggregate demand spikes, corporate revenues across the German economy increase. Businesses generate higher profits. And who owns those businesses?
The people already living there.
Who holds the equity, the commercial real estate, and the shares in those local and national enterprises?
The native population. The existing capital class, the small business owners, the native shareholders.
Exactly. The native population absorbs the economic windfall of the demand shock because the profits from that increased entrepreneurial activity naturally flow upward to the existing owners of capital.
But it doesn't stop there.
No, because as the refugees overcome the friction and enter the labor force, which is the supply effect, they fundamentally expand the productive capacity of the nation.
They are building new machinery, they're writing new software, they're providing new services, they're generating new value that literally did not exist the year prior.
And while the refugees receive wages in exchange for their labor, the total value they add to the economy is always greater than their wage.
The surplus value.
Yes, that surplus value, the margin between the cost of their labor and the revenue it generates, benefits the broader society through corporate growth, increased tax pools, and a stabilizing pension system.
So the studies models actually prove that while the per capita income of the native population takes a marginal dip in the first 2 years.
As they bear the immediate tax burden of the integration infrastructure, yes.
Right. But by year 6, 7, and beyond, their individual income sits definitively higher than it would have in a theoretical timeline where the refugees never crossed the border.
The data proves that taking in vulnerable populations isn't an act of pure economic charity. It is an act of long-term economic self-interest.
Which forces us into a very uncomfortable, strictly analytical corner here.
How so?
Well, if the empirical data from one of the most respected economic institutes in Europe demonstrates that this is a highly profitable long-term investment, why does the burden narrative so completely dominate the public and political debate?
This raises an important question, and we have to analyze this disconnect purely as a structural phenomenon.
Right, without taking political sides.
Exactly. It is a collision between macroeconomic timelines and human psychology, compounded by the architecture of our political systems.
Let's start with the political systems. The structural problem is the political calendar, isn't it?
Yes. A national economy operates on a horizon of decades. The DIW graph shows a smooth, profitable curve over 20 years. But a politician, they operate on an election cycle of 4 years.
So if you overlay a 4-year political term onto the Fratzscher and Juncker graph, the misalignment is glaring. A politician who champions this human capital investment in year 1 must face the voters in year 4.
Which is the exact nadir of the graph. It is the precise moment when the financial costs have peaked, the bureaucratic friction is causing the most visible societal tension, and the economic dividends have not yet materialized.
The political incentive structure is aggressively biased against long-term investments.
The political risk is entirely concentrated on the incumbent, while the massive economic reward is delayed until a future administration is in power. There is zero immediate political capital to be gained from a 10-year economic dividend.
And it's compounded by how our brains process information, right? The costs of integration are highly centralized and terrifyingly visible.
Extremely visible.
A municipal budget line item showing a 50 million euro expenditure for a new reception center is a concrete, easily weaponized number.
While the subsequent economic growth is decentralized and almost entirely invisible on a daily basis.
You don't see it on the evening news.
No. When the national GDP grows by a fraction of a percent, or a local supply chain adds 3 new jobs because of downstream demand, no one notices. It is a slow, quiet, dispersed accumulation of wealth.
So our evolutionary psychology is basically hardwired to prioritize immediate, visible resource loss over abstract, long-term resource generation.
The data struggles to penetrate the public anxiety because it is fighting millions of years of survival instincts.
Understanding those mechanics, understanding exactly why our society instinctively rejects the data, is the crucial first step. And this brings us to the core mission of Empower Migra. We want to shift you, the listener, from passively consuming these economic models to actively interrogating the frameworks we use to build our society.
It requires a fundamental rewiring of our linguistic and conceptual habits.
Seriously, ask yourself, why do we, as a highly industrialized society, universally apply the vocabulary of costs and burdens to human beings arriving at our borders, while reserving the vocabulary of investments and capital potential exclusively for corporate entities?
It's a striking double standard.
Right. When a massive tech conglomerate spends billions to acquire a startup that currently generates zero revenue, the financial press applauds them for their visionary investment in future market share.
They do.
Why do we refuse to apply that same visionary logic to human beings who are the literal engines that build those companies and drive those markets?
We must also confront our obsession with short-term metrics. We have meticulously established that the initial frictional costs are real and massive. But if we allow the panic of a localized 2-year budget deficit to dictate our overarching national policy, we are actively sabotaging our own future.
Imagine looking at this from the perspective of an aging society. What happens if Germany, or any similarly structured Western nation, decides to ignore this data? What happens if the fear of the initial friction wins, and they just shut the grid down?
The alternative is an unavoidable demographic collapse. If an aging society rejects the influx of working-age capital, the ratio of retirees to active workers will fatally destabilize.
Like we talked about earlier.
Yes, and to maintain the existing social safety nets, the state will be forced to drastically increase the tax burden on a shrinking pool of native workers.
The domestic consumer base will physically shrink. Local businesses will close, not because of competition, but because there simply aren't enough people left to buy their goods.
Innovation stagnates because the talent pool becomes entirely static. By obsessively trying to avoid the short-term, visible cost of integration, a society mathematically guarantees a much more severe, entirely irreversible long-term cost: the slow structural decay of its own economic foundation.
The 2015 DIW Berlin study is not just an analysis of a historical event.
Yeah.
It is a blueprint for escaping that decay.
It absolutely is.
Based on the rigorous macroeconomic modeling of Fratzscher and Juncker, the fundamental paradigm we use to debate immigration is entirely backward. We exhaust ourselves debating the question, can we afford to manage migration? Do we have the funds to pay for this?
But facing the stark demographic realities of the 21st century, the only scientifically sound question we should be asking is, can we afford not to use this potential?
If human capital is the singular, irreplaceable source of long-term economic expansion, then turning away willing, working-age individuals is the macroeconomic equivalent of financial self-sabotage.
We're leaving our most valuable potential resource outside the gates simply because we lack the institutional patience to process the initial paperwork.
And that's the exact perspective shift we are aiming for here today. That was a deep dive for Empower Migra. Empower Migra understanding begins with listening.
But before we conclude, we want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to turn over in your mind.
Yeah, let's hear it.
We have spent this entire deep dive proving that even under the most pessimistic constraints, where language barriers are high, credentialing is slow, and initial unemployment is rampant, these arriving individuals still generate a net positive return on investment within a decade.
Right. The power grid eventually stabilizes and generates wealth despite the massive initial friction.
So consider this. If we know the return on human capital is mathematically positive, even when the system is operating poorly, How much unprecedented economic growth are we actively suppressing as a society by making that initial integration process harder, slower, and more bureaucratic than it actually needs to be?
Oh, wow.
What would our national wealth look like if we treated that initial friction not as a necessary evil to endure, but as a systemic inefficiency to be aggressively optimized?
If the investment yields a profit, even when we actively throw sand in the gears, imagine what happens when we actually decide to lubricate the machine. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.